Hello, you're listening to Politics Uncensored with me, Zoe Grunewald, and happy International Men's Day to all who celebrate. Coming up on the show, we'll be discussing Shabana Mahmood's latest crackdown on asylum seekers, and then Ali will be speaking to The Guardian's Aditya Chakrabarti about why a wealth tax may not be the silver bullet many hoped for. And as always, you can find us at Politics Uncensored on social media. But first, it's the Week Unwrapped. Nigel Farage has been accused by former schoolmates of racist and anti-Semitic behaviour at school. BAFTA-winning director Peter Etejawi has come forward claiming that Farage used language such as Hitler was right or gas them while at school. These claims come after fellow pupils at Dulwich College, where Farage attended school, have spoken to the Guardian newspaper. Farage has, of course, denied he was anti-Semitic at school, saying he was not necessarily said racist things. It depends on how you define it. Former Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy has also claimed that Farage flirted with the Hitler Youth as a young man. Reform UK have claimed The Guardian is attempting to smear the party. Well, joining me to discuss this is Laura Beveridge from Politics Joe. Laura, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's always good to have you on. Let's talk about this story, because my reading of this is that this is a pretty damning character expose. But the problem with stories like this is it's kind of a he said, she said, right? It's very, very difficult to prove historical allegations of comments that people have said.
Well, that was what Farage has dismissed the story as, is essentially one person's word against another. But in the article, it's actually not just one person, it's quite a lot of people from his year at school who remember him at school, who all have accounts that really do quite line up with each other. And even other people in that article that said that they were part of using that language as well, and that it wasn't actually, well, that Farage was maybe more extreme than some, but that language was at some points normalized, but they now express 40 years on contrition or regret, and they feel like they haven't seen that from Nigel Farage, and that's what they want to see from him. And Starmer wants to see that as well, because he's called for Farage to address these comments.
And in terms of how these comments have been kind of received by people like Starmer, as you were saying, David Lammy, opposition MPs to Farage, obviously there's been a lot of condemnation. Do you think this is the sort of thing that can move opinion polls when it comes to Farage? As we said, they're difficult to prove. There are more and more voices stacking up. Do you think there is a section of potential reform voters who will read or hear about something like this and say, actually, this is not a man I want as Prime Minister?
Well, these specific claims about what Nigel Farage was like at school are new. It isn't, we already knew what Farage was like at school, because we knew that teachers had expressed concerns about Farage holding racist and neo-fascist views. That was published before he was an MP, before he won his seat in Clacton. So we knew what Farage was like at school. We also have to remember that this is a country where Boris Johnson, the previous Prime Minister, was elected after using racial slurs in a Telegraph article that he used as a grown man, not as a school student. So it's not unprecedented that the British public, or sections of the British public, would be willing to vote someone in with a past like Farage's.
And I'm interested in reading the piece that some of the people that The Guardian spoke to basically said, yes, this is a pattern of behaviour. This was deliberate racism. This is who this man is. Etedri had said, actually, just hearing that aggressive, hectoring tone again, my blood ran cold. This was in reference to seeing Farage many, many years later after their days at school together, talking in the European Parliament. Others in the article say, actually, he was just a sort of provocateur. He said these things to get under people's skin. He's kind of bumptious and controversial. And, it was more kind of a young, entitled boy saying things to get a reaction. Does that really fly as an excuse?
I mean, they make it clear in that Guardian piece that there's not a claim that Farage, the man today, holds the same views that he held as a young boy. But there is what these people want. These people who went to school with him want is they want moral clarity. They want certainty on that. They want to hear contrition or regret, which Farage hasn't given. And in fact, that's quite in character for him. If we look at his response to Sarah Sarah Potchin, who was the MP who was asked to apologise for statements she made regarding what she thought about Black people being in advertisements on TV. And Nigel Farage didn't call those comments racist. He just called them wrong and ugly. So I'm not sure we're going to see him admit that his own behaviour was racist.
No, I think probably not. I'm there was more allegations out of a similar vein today. Do you get the impression that this is a story that's going to run, or do you think it's going to be swept under the carpet? I mean, it's one of those stories that, to me, I think around a group of people who already don't like Farage, it will continue to circulate. But I just don't know, because it's quite hard to prove historical allegations, whether it will stick with those people that already like Farage and are pretty much settled on him.
I'm not sure that this will have much impact amongst people that are already reform minded. I was actually up in Durham earlier this week speaking to the vice president of the newly launched Students for Reform Society, who only had very positive things to say about Nigel Farage, and that it is this sort of like provocative character that Nigel Farage plays that is attractive to many young people who are now considering voting reform. And if we look at the past of some of these young people voting reform themselves, Jack Eccles, who is now the president of Students for Reform, appointed by Nigel Farage, Hope Not Hate published an article which contained evidence that he'd attended Tommy Robinson rallies.
Extraordinary. I mean, we'll be keeping an eye on this because I'm sure more and more stuff's going to come out. But in terms of how reform is doing at the minute, and obviously we'll come on to the big asylum proposals that were announced by the government this week, but what is your feeling with the way reform is heading? Do you think they're going to continue polling ahead of Labour? Do you think they are on an upward march here, or do you think we might have seen the peak of Farage and the peak of Farage and the Reform Party?
I've not seen, going out speaking to people across the country, which I do for my job at Politics Joe, I haven't seen any evidence that people are moving away from reform. In fact, it's really hard to find somewhere in the UK where I go that people don't tell me that they're going to vote reform. And I think what Labour needs to be concerned about and consider is that they can't just be seeking to appease reform voters, because in doing that they're going to lose their traditional base. And when I was up at Durham speaking to students, I spoke to lots of students who said they'd voted Labour in 2024 but wouldn't consider doing it now because of some of the rhetoric that's come from this government and now the policies on asylum, and that they're looking towards people like Zach Blansky.
Very interesting. We'll keep an eye on all of that. Reform, unfortunately, never goes away and continues in our Week Unwrapped week on week. So thank you for that, Laura. Let's move on to the next story. This is about the government's new guidance for single-sex spaces, which apparently could involve trans women being questioned over their access rights. This is reporting from The Times that transgender people could be barred from single-sex services even when their biological sex matches. The guidance has suggested that service providers such as hospital wards, gyms, and leisure centres will all be able to question transgender women over whether they should be using single-sex facilities such as toilets and changing rooms based on how they look, their behaviour, or concerns raised by others. Now, of course, this could potentially amount to policing femininity, to be able to use the bathroom. There's serious questions about how on earth you can discriminate whether or not someone can use a particular service simply based on the way they look. And their behaviour or concerns raised by others sounds very, very broad indeed. Laura, what is your reading of this? I mean, it sounds to me like this guidance is still potentially in the process of being cobbled together, but this is pretty worrying for the trans community.
Absolutely. I mean, the Labour government said that this was leaked guidance, and the Labour government said they're going to take as long as possible to get this right before they publish it. But I do think it is incredibly concerning, not just for the trans community, but the effect this is going to have on women generally, all women inclusively. Because like you said, how do you know someone is transgender? How do you prove if they deny it, or how do you prove whether they're being honest or not about that? And this will, in all likelihood, lead to women who aren't transgender being asked to prove whether they are or not, just because they might have, say, short hair, for example. It's going to have the very unfeminist effect of pushing women to conform to gender stereotypes in order to not be questioned about whether they're trans or not.
And equally, of course, the logic holds that that would also mean trans men would have to use female facilities. And of course, trans men, if they have transitioned, will not look like women at all. So this is incredibly confusing guidance. And it sounds, pretty unenforceable in my mind. I'm not sure how you could expect hospital wards, gyms, leisure centres, places that are, staffed by people who might often be working kind of part-time or on insecure contracts, or potentially not going to want to go into single sex facilities and try and drag people out according to how they look.
Yeah, I mean, the point you made about trans men there is so interesting because the guidance said that a trans man could be excluded from women-only services, even though his biological sex is
Mm,
female, because he presents as a man, and that users could reasonably object to his presence. But that means that he could both be excluded from the space of the gender that he chooses to identify as and the space of his sex at birth, essentially meaning that he just wouldn't have access to any facilities. Which I think in the guidance they keep using this phrasing, well, these decisions would need to be proportionate and reasonable when businesses enforce them, but who is deciding what's proportionate and what's reasonable?
mm. I find it terribly ironic that the sort of papers that will be applauding this kind of um, policing of single-sex spaces are the same papers that would be up in arms at any new regulations for businesses. Because I just think asking your staff to wade in on this, as well as how humiliating this is for trans people and and women, full stop, to have their femininity and the way they look policed. But the idea that you can ask businesses to kind of wade in on this and get their staff to stop people from accessing services. And the other point I would make is, I think if anybody is behaving in a way that is inappropriate in a hospital ward, gym, or leisure centre, they should be asked to be removed anyway, regardless of their sex, right? Our customers can complain about that anyway.
Exactly. I mean, the rules, regulations, laws are already there to keep people safe in single sex spaces. We don't need to be policing the trans community or the cisgender community about these things because, as you said, businesses already have the right to throw people out who are making people uncomfortable via their behavior. So I don't really understand the point of this this
Yeah.
guidance.
And we should also mention that today is Transgender Day of Remembrance. Um, the founder of the Trans Solidarity Alliance said these leaks reveal that not only does the EHRC's proposed code of practice seek to require trans exclusion, but it would be a disaster if this exclusionary guidance is approved. Laura, we're going to move on to our final story before we go to the break. We've got a couple of minutes for this. This is about the government confirming that there will be a ban on reselling tickets for profit. So this is great news for any listeners who enjoy attending gigs but aren't enjoying the hugely extortionate price tags that often come with it. So on Wednesday, the government confirmed that reselling tickets above face value will be outlawed. The Business Department Minister Kate Did has claimed that the decision was a no-brainer. Stars such as Dua Lipa have been among those calling for Starmer to tackle the pernicious ticket tout websites and stop fan exploitation. I should say my friend was trying to get Lily Allen tickets, and she tried to look in the resale queue, and they were going for over £500, and plus. So it is extortionate that we've got to this point. What do you make of this? I mean, this is like a bit of good news that will appeal to a certain group of voters, and maybe the government should get a pat on the back for that.
I mean, this feels like an easy win, and it's a bit strange that it took Dua Lipa, Coldplay, Sam Fender, Radiohead all writing an open letter to Keir Starmer to urge him to keep his election promise to protect fans from online ticket touts. And it's bad news for any Oasis fans because it's coming a bit too late. And there were some tickets this summer going for, I think, £4,000 for the Wembley show. So perhaps maybe if it had been brought in a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is an easy win for the Labour government. And I think there are some questions about how it might be enforced, and obviously the platforms themselves saying that the resale platforms saying that this is just going to push people into a dark market of selling these tickets, but then other people on the other side saying that it doesn't go far enough and that the Labour government should look at dynamic pricing as well that could be used for tickets in light of this too.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm not a person who does a huge amount of gigs. I kind of assumed that most people get their resold tickets through like Twitter and Instagram, where it's just a random person and you're kind of working on trust anyway. So it does seem to me that this isn't going to do a great deal to stop that kind of practice happening, right?
Yeah, it might be quite hard to enforce on those sorts of platforms, like people selling it one to one. But I think in terms of the industrial scale ticket touts, it will have an impact on their business model.
Absolutely. Okay, Laura, thank you so much. That's it for the Week Unwrapped. Coming up after the break, myself and Laura will be discussing the government's new asylum seeker restrictions. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're listening to Politics Uncensored with me, Zoe Grunewald, and joining us still is junior political correspondent at Politics Joe, Laura Beveridge. So the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, announced a swathe of new restrictions and regulations for asylum seekers in the UK. The most controversial of which being taking jewellery, not wedding rings, from people arriving in the UK claiming asylum to help pay for their accommodation. People will also only be granted asylum in the UK if they have been had their status reviewed every 30 months and have been here for a 20-year period. The scheme mirrors the approach in Denmark, where refugees get 2-year permits and must reapply when they expire. And all of this is going to go alongside a human rights law overhaul. So the Home Secretary plans to end the process of allowing multiple appeals in asylum cases, replacing it with a single consolidated appeal where all grounds must be raised at once. And to do this, the government will introduce a law to change how the right to family life under Article 8 of the ECHR is applied in migration court cases. Lots and lots of other things to get into. That was announced this week, Laura. But before we sort of go into the other details, I just want to know what your initial response to these new rules was.
I mean, I think seems very extreme. I don't think it's what anyone was expecting this Labour government to do on asylum. I'm not even sure it's what anyone who voted Labour wanted the government to do on asylum. But Shabana Mahmood has put forward the argument for this, the premise for being as extreme as they have been, as if we don't quell public anger at the asylum system, which we know exists at YouGov, it's the #1 issue for voters in this country. Whenever I'm out speaking to people in lots of different towns, asylum and immigration comes up constantly. Shabana Mahmood says if we don't quell that anger, we are paving the way for a reform government that will do something even more extreme.
And we should probably get into the details of that, but I just want to unpick that claim a bit, because that is something that you're absolutely right that Shabana Mahmood has been saying as the basis of the need for this policy, which is that unless you do control illegal or irregular immigration, it will allow people like Nigel Farage and those on the right to continue making hay out of the problem, and she was basically making the case that this contributes to growing levels of racism and race hate in the UK. But that doesn't sit very well with me, and I think a few other people, because it kind of acknowledges their point, right? It gives them ground. It basically says, yes, this is a problem, and it kind of almost understands why people might have, animosity towards asylum seekers or immigrants. It kind of blames them, the immigrants themselves, for the problem rather than the structural conditions that created it. And there's also the case that, actually, this is a tiny portion of migration, right? Illegal immigration. It's about 4%, I think. We actually take, per capita less than most countries in Europe. We don't take a huge amount. I mean, the relative numbers are, the absolute numbers are high, but relatively they aren't as high as the rest of Europe. Is it not the case that by introducing such harsh reforms and pushing this up the agenda, she is just ceding ground to Nigel Farage and saying, yes, you and your voters are right to think this is such a major issue, even though if you actually look at the real issues facing voters across the country, cost of living, problems with the NHS, problems with public services, they aren't the fault of asylum seekers.
I think the reason that this is so high up on voters' agendas across the country is because the asylum system itself, and especially the small boats and then subsequently the hotels, they became a spectacle. They were incredibly visual and almost easier to understand than other flows of migration into the UK, because like you said, asylum accounts for a very small number of immigrants into the UK. And also the misinformation around the asylum system is so rampant. This idea that they're handed iPhones by the Home Office is something that comes up a lot, because I've gone to these protests outside hotels to report on them. And those sort of beliefs and misinformation and myths around the asylum system are so prominent. And I think that perhaps the government could have also taken the line of communicating more clearly with the British public about what the asylum system as it is actually involves. And I think the Labour Party are with this sort of legislation, because parts of these reforms will have to pass through Parliament. If they don't manage to appease the Parliamentary Labour Party, if they're forced to U-turn again, it raises serious questions about what sort of legislation this government can push through, because they had to U-turn on winter fuel, they've had to U-turn on PIP payments as well, and it would question what can they get through and if they even can govern. But interestingly, it's in Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives' interest for this legislation to pass, because if anger at the asylum system isn't quashed, if the reform momentum isn't stopped, Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives could be wiped out in the next election.
Yeah, that's all very interesting, and I think what you were saying particularly about this becoming kind of, this is such a visual issue, right? The images of small boats coming over. You're right, it's easy to understand, it's easy to get angry at, and I think there has been a real sense of, as people have been dealing with the impact of austerity and declining living standards, that element of fair play. You know, the idea that someone could come over here and get a hotel room. It's such an easy argument to understand, even if it isn't quite that logical, even if it doesn't work that way. It's so easy to be exploited by people like Nigel Farage. And of course, the other issue is, you know, the asylum system is broken. I don't think anybody on any side of the political spectrum would argue that it is working in a way that is optimal for either asylum seekers themselves or the government or British nationals. You know, clearly, if people are getting on small boats and making those dangerous crossings, something is broken there. One of the things I guess we could potentially celebrate in the package of reforms unveiled by the Home Secretary is the potential creation of new safe and legal routes. But these are, as far as I'm aware, quite vague. We don't really know exactly what those routes will be as of yet. And there is going to be an annual cap on numbers as well. What do you make of that?
It is well, I think if we look at reform of the asylum system in its broader sense, and kind of what you mentioned about how it's broken, it's not working for anyone, there needs to be reform on some level. I think there is a question about looking at the accommodation providers in this system who, but frankly, there's been lots of reports about how poor some of the quality of accommodation is, and that goes back to the idea of this myth that these hotels are luxurious places, but in actuality they really aren't, and people are stuck there sometimes because of backlogs for years. But then you have these contractors, there's about 3 of them, and they are making hundreds of millions of pounds in profits from the contracts that the Home Office are handing out to them. And there was a Home Office Select Committee report that said that they essentially have been handed these contracts, and then there's been no oversight from the Home Office on whether they're delivering or not. And I think so if you want to look at, well, who's profiting from this system? Well, everyone else is miserable, the taxpayer, the government, and the asylum seekers themselves. We should really be looking at reforming how these contracts are handed out.
Absolutely. Let's look at the big sort of headline here, which was that refugee status will become temporary. So people granted in the UK will only be allowed to stay in the country temporarily, with their status reviewed every 13 months. And they'll only be allowed to settle if they're here for 20 years. That is, previously it was a 5-year term, right, for asylum seekers. That is a huge increase. How is this being received by Labour MPs, voters, the commentariat, as you like? What do people think about this extension of the period of time?
I mean, we've seen Labour MPs that typically don't speak out against the government line. That would largely be the new intakes, although not exclusively. Speak out against these asylum reforms. And we've seen people like Zach Polanski urging Labour MPs to vote with their conscience. Unfortunately, I think it might be a bit more realpolitik than that. And I think what might decide which way Labour MPs vote on this might be whether Reform or the Greens came second in their constituency, and that might be the deciding factor. But I think on that point that you made about it now being 20 years before you can settle for indefinite leave to remain, 30 months that you have to keep reapplying to have your status reviewed, that's actually harsher than the system in Denmark that these reforms are modelled on. And I think if the Labour Party want to look to Denmark, who the Social Democrats there, the centre-left party, brought in these reforms as a way of fending off their equivalent of reform, their populist far-right party. And if you look at how that's worked out for them, well, they just lost the mayoralty of Copenhagen for the first time in decades to the Green Left Party. And I think in the UK we might see Zach Plansky and the Greens picking up a lot of disenfranchised Labour voters.
That's really, really interesting, and I think um, it's interesting that they've mirrored so much from Denmark, but actually, when you look at how Denmark is doing the Social Democratic Party, it looks like it's actually struggling. And what we've actually seen is what they've been sort of pushing rightwards on immigration, but the same thing has happened. They haven't been seen to necessarily have got a grip on it. It's just raised the salience of it, and voters are departing them from either direction because of their policy position. The other thing here, of course, is this attempt from the government to overhaul the ECHR to do this. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Conservatives have very clearly been pulled in the direction of reform on the ECHR. And I think we saw briefings a while back now that Keir Starmer was considering looking, not scrapping the ECHR, but considering how you could change the legal interpretation of two specific parts, Article 3 and Article 8, which are the ones that deal with your right to a private family life and your right to to live freely from torture and imprisonment. And his argument was that these things were being used specifically to stop asylum seekers who had committed crimes in the UK from being deported, because obviously prisons in other countries tend to be
Laura, I think unless I'm being mistaken, I think we might have lost you for a second. That's all right. Oh, you're back. Hello.
I'm back.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. You were just saying about the Article 8 and Article 3.
Yeah, so these are the ones that the right to live to have a private life and live freely from torture. But Keir Starmer, we saw a while ago, was speaking about how these articles were being used in appeals to stop deportation, specifically from people with asylum claims that had committed crimes in this country. And so I think we had known that re-looking at the interpretation of the ECHR was on the books by this Labour government for a while now.
Very, very interesting. And you spoke about kind of how this was being received by Labour MPs across the board. And there is the kind of sense that for many of them, this will be a moral red line. But I'm interested to know if you actually think these are things that are going to be workable, because ultimately this Labour government will be thinking, if we can actually bring these numbers down, that's the only metric we care about. Do you think these things will work? Will they prevent small boat crossings? Will they bring the asylum numbers down significantly? Will they actually be able to get any success from this?
Well, I think if you look at the pull factors, which is this phrase that the Labour government keep using for why asylum seekers are coming to the UK versus maybe other safe countries that are closer, they've said things like it's the offer of hotels, it's the offer of how good Britain's benefits system is. But there's been other reports done into what the pull factors of Britain are. And often it's things like the fact that our language is English, and that's a lot of people's second language versus maybe more other European languages. So just the fact that we speak English, the fact that there might already be existing family members here. And these are pull factors that the government can't legislate away in the way they're attempting to do with hotels.
Absolutely. Laura, thank you so much. That was really, really useful. I'm sure we're going to be keeping an eye on this. I think you said that these are proposals that there will be a vote on in the House of Commons. Is that correct?
Yes, some of these proposals will require a law change.
Okay, interesting. And do we know when that will be?
I have not seen when that will be yet.
Often with the government, these things come out sort of a few days before on the House of Commons business, and then journalists kind of scramble to it. So I'm sure we'll get you back on to talk about this as more unfolds. But thank you so much for joining us, Laura. And tell the listeners where they can find more of your work.
At Politics Joe on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, and I'm Laura Beveridge 7 on Twitter.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Speak soon.